All right, so we talked yesterday about the steps of natural selection, talking about, so how do these things happen? The steps that we talked about were variation, so there's differences. Then there's a struggle for survival, where all of the members of a species, they cannot all survive. The ones that do survive are the best adapted, the ones with the best traits. And then over time, they're able to reproduce, and those traits that are helpful become more and more common, and any trait that's harmful becomes less common. So we're going to talk about some examples today and some other information related to natural selection. The first one is this variation. So we said yesterday, variation means differences. And obviously there's differences between all of us. We have lots of variation. So do all species, whether it's tomato plants or squirrels or bacteria. There's variation in the species. They're not every individual is identical. Why? So why are there so many differences? Why are we all so different from each other? So?
Because of like our parents?
Yeah, it has to do with our parents.
Or blood?
Well, not so much our blood. Because of the DNA we get. And where do you get? Half of your DNA came from your parents, half from your mother, half from your father. That's always the case. Okay? And because of that, because sexual reproduction mixes genes from two different parents, what we end up with is new combinations of traits. Okay? Just like if you took a deck of cards, every time you shuffle it, you're going to get new combination, new order of those cards. Well, sexual reproduction works in a similar way, that every time parents reproduce, they mix up the genes, and you end up with new combinations of those characteristics. That adds variety to the species. Species that reproduce sexually have a lot more variation between individuals than species that reproduce asexually. So that's one place this variation comes from. Another place is through something that we call mutations. And sometimes people get the wrong idea about what a mutation is. You probably think like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or like X-Men or something. So a mutation is not something that gives a person superpowers or something like that. Really what a mutation is, it's just a change in the DNA of a species. Just when one letter of the DNA, you can think about DNA is kind of like an alphabet of letters that make who we are. And sometimes one of those letters gets changed by accident. It's an unplanned change. Kind of like a mistake when there's just an error in the copying of the DNA.
Where does our DNA go?
It's in all of our cells, in the nucleus of them, chromosomes which are made of DNA. So it's sort of found all throughout our body in almost every cell. So these mutations, when a cell is reproducing, sometimes there's a change in the DNA. And now sometimes it results in a trait that could be harmful. Sometimes the mutation may mean a certain enzyme in our body doesn't work properly. It can make us sick. Obviously that's not a beneficial trait. Sometimes it may be a beneficial trait. It may be useful for the species. Sometimes it doesn't have an effect either way. It doesn't positively influence or negatively. Kind of like if you're trying to type word for word a paper you're reading, and you make a typo. Okay? And maybe you mix up one letter with another. Well, sometimes it's going to make a word that doesn't mean anything. Other times it may make a different word. Okay? And so it just sort of depends on what the mistake was. But that's another way that species develop variations. Okay? Differences among them. And it's important. We have to have differences between the individuals in order for natural selection to work. If we had a population of squirrels living out in the forest, and they were all exactly identical to each other in every way, would any of them be better adapted than others? No. None of them would have an advantage either way, and therefore natural selection wouldn't work. You have to have some variation for natural selection to work. All right, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of different examples of some adaptations that different species have to give us some idea about how evolution works. So this first one's kind of interesting. Probably most of you have seen a peacock before, right? And at the zoo, they walk around and stuff. A peacock is a male peafowl. The general word for them is a peafowl. It's like a rooster's a male chicken and a hen's a female chicken. A peacock's a male peafowl. A peahen is a female peafowl. But you probably have noticed the male peacocks because of their tail feathers, because they have these very long feathers, very brightly colored, very showy. But the female, the peahen, actually just looks kind of like a sort of boring color. They don't have this elaborate tail like the males do. How is this helpful? How is this a useful adaptation for the species? How is it helpful for the male to have those huge feathers? Anybody know? Karina?
The animal can like come up to them and like kind of scare them, but then they put up their tail and it looks like eyeballs.
Yeah. That could be a part of it. There's also another important part, maybe more important. Okay?
Breeding.
For breeding. Because males use those tail feathers to attract mates. Okay? Female peahens, they choose a mate based on the tail feathers of the males that are in their area. They'll choose to mate with the male that has the showiest feathers, the brightest colors, and so forth. So it's an advantage for the males to have those very large feathers. So why don't the females have them? Charlie?
So they can tell each other apart.
Partially, they could probably tell them even without those feathers. Good idea, though. Logan?
So they can reproduce?
No, they could still reproduce if they had them.
So, because the female really doesn't need them as much as the male does.
Yeah, and could they be a disadvantage?
Yeah.
When would they be a disadvantage?
When like she said like an animal's trying to come behind them.
Yeah, when there's predators around. Having huge tail feathers is not helpful when there's a predator around because they make you more
Don't they use it?
likely to be seen.
Don't they use them to blend in though?
No, not really.
But can they put them down?
Yeah.
They can, but they're still there. They're still, it's not like they get completely disappear. So the females don't really need them. In fact, the females are just sort of small and boring color. This is often the case with lots of animals. Like, do you know what a male or duck looks like? What do the males look like? Kayla? Yeah, lots of bright colors, like a green head. But female mallards, you know what they look like? There's brown, sort of tan color. You often see this, that males are brightly colored, females are sort of drab colored. And that's because the females generally have to do what after they mate? Lay eggs and then
They have to hide.
hide, care for their young for a while. And so being sort of drab colored allows you to blend in better. Whereas males are more concerned about finding a mate. Females also have to be concerned about raising those young and keeping them protected. So they are sort of those boring colors.
Is it pronounced peafowl or
Yeah.
peafowl?
You follow? So in natural selection, any trait, any variation that's helpful is going to be selected for by nature. There's a beneficial trait, those members are going to survive, and it's going to become more abundant, more common in the population. Any variation that's harmful or selected against is going to become rare or even disappear completely.
What does a
it will become more common, I guess. So if there's a variation that's selected for, it's going to become more common in the species. Tim?
Isn't it the same thing with like the bird, like robins? Like they're red and then the
Yep.
girls are like
Yep.
gray.
Yep. A lot of birds especially are like that. Trout are fish. And again, a trout can lay hundreds of thousands of eggs. They all cannot possibly survive. It's impossible.
Only one left.
Which one lives?
It was Nemo.
Why did Nemo live?
Because he was
Because he
hidden, he
fell.
fell. He was hidden.
He was awesome because
Okay.
he showed some.
So the ones that do survive are going to be the ones that are best adapted to that environment. And if they can survive, they can then reproduce and pass on.
What was that?
That's a video that doesn't work. All right, so let's talk about another example. So Charles Darwin, we saw the video that told a little bit about what he did. He traveled around the world on this ship called the Beagle and collected specimens everywhere he stopped. He eventually brought them home and started to study them. One of the areas he went to were the Galapagos Islands. Galapagos Islands are off the coast of South America. They have lots of unique organisms that live there, and he studied them very carefully. One specific species he studied was this group of finches, the Galapagos Finches. Okay? And what he noticed is that these finches, so the Galapagos are a whole series of islands, and he noticed all the finches basically looked the same. They had very, very similar body shapes and sizes and so forth. But there was one big difference when he looked at the finches on each island. What do you think it is? Rita? Their beaks were different. So this got Darwin to thinking, well, probably all of these finch they started as one species that spread out and went to the various islands. And then once they were on the islands, each population started to adapt differently. Why do you think they all had different beaks? The finch that were on these different islands. Jaden?
For the different food they eat.
Yes, because on each island there were different food sources. And so once the finches made it to these islands, they started to evolve to have beaks that help them get as much food as possible. And so what you see when you look at these finches, some of their beaks are adapted to eating fruit. This sort of pretty thick, sharp bill allows them to get the fruit off of trees. Other islands, their main source of food was seeds. And some islands had seeds with very thick shells on them that the finches needed to break through, so they ended up evolving these large, thick beaks. Some had smaller beaks for the ones that had smaller seeds available. Some even ate insects, small insects, large insects. Some ate cactus. And so Darwin started to think about this and understand that each of these birds had adapted over a long period of time to perfectly suit whatever foods were available on that island. Michael?
Couldn't you eat some cactuses inside?
Yeah. All right, here's another example. And this is probably something you've heard. How many people have had strep throat? Probably almost everybody, or ear infections. All right. So if you have strep throat, you have a sore throat, it's really bad, it's not getting better, what is causing it? What causes strep throat? Michael?
Bacteria.
Yeah, a special bacteria that grows in your throat, called Streptococcus bacteria. And that's what causes strep throat. They grow on your throat, they irritate it, they damage the tissue, so it hurts. So if you go to the doctor, they gag you with that huge Q-tip, and they take a culture, and they say, yes, you have strep throat. What is the treatment then? What do they give you to help you feel better? Jackie? They give you an antibiotic. An antibiotic is a medication that specifically kills bacteria. So, you get your antibiotic, like amoxicillin or that pink stuff that bubbles on everyone hates now.
I had a monkey.
Yeah. So they give you your antibiotic. After a day, what starts to happen to the bacteria in your throat? Gianna?
It starts developing to make you feel better.
Yeah, they start dying off. This antibiotic starts killing them. Now, which bacteria in your throat do you think die off first?
The bad ones.
Well, they're all bad. Rita?
The smaller ones.
Smaller ones, the ones that are kind of weak, the ones that were not very strong, they die off pretty quick. So you continue to take your antibiotic for day 2, day 3, and more of these bacteria are dying, and your throat's starting to feel better. So what do they say? Does the doctor say, okay, once your throat feels better, stop taking your medicine?
No.
They say you have to take all of the medication, all 10 days usually. The reason they're telling you that is because of evolution. Because after 4 days, probably almost all of the bacteria are dead. Your throat feels fine. But there's probably still some hanging on. Which ones are probably still alive? Marley? What's that? Well, not so much larger. Rachel? The strongest ones, the ones that are most resistant. And so if you then stop taking your antibiotic, what happens to those stronger bacteria that were still hanging on in there? Caitlin?
Those keep like getting stronger and bigger.
Yeah, they start to, what's the word we're looking for? Multiply, reproduce. And now, those strong bacteria start reproducing, all of a sudden your throat starts hurting again. But this time, your infection has made all of these strong bacteria, and it's going to be much harder to cure. So that's why when you go to the doctor, they tell you to take all of the antibiotics, so that by the time 10 days are probably you've killed all of them, even the strongest ones can't survive all 10 days of the antibiotic. And so you take all of your medications so you don't get that infection back again in the stronger version. Kayla?
Why do you have kinds if you don't need them?
You have lots of ones you can live, so it's not so much that you don't need them. They serve a function. Okay, they're part of our immune tissue, really. So they do have a function, but you can live without them. Just like, you have 2 kidneys, but you can live without one. Or you have an appendix. I don't have one, though. But you can live without it.
Took yours out?
Yeah.
I got
So
mine.
Because it was infected and it was going to explode. No, it's almost erupted.
Did it hurt when you get out?
Yeah.
Did you get to see it?
So,
I wish I could see it.
yeah, Michael?
Don't you need like 25%?
What's that?
Then you need like 25% of your organ or something though?
I don't know, like maybe your liver or something?
Yes.
I don't know. Some organs you can live without with a reduced portion of, yes.
What are some other organs that you can live without?
I mean, you could live with one lung, you could live with one kidney, you could live with part of your liver damage. There's lots of organs. Yeah.
You can live with one lung.
All right, let's move on now from missing organs to something else. Marty, a question about evolution? All right, we're moving on. Sorry. All right, camouflage. Camouflage is an excellent example when you're talking about adaptations because many species exhibit camouflage coloration. Here's a flounder that lives in the ocean. Here's the fish. It has sort of perfect coloration that allows it to blend in with the bottom of the ocean. These are ibises. They're deer. They live in the Middle East. They live in dry, sort of rocky areas. There's one here.
It's just not noticeable because it's in black and white.
No, it's not black and white. So there's one here. You can see its antlers up here. It's facing sideways. Here's one, a small one, facing forward. And here's the other one. You can see its legs down here. Its head's right there. There's another one?
Yes.
More than 3?
Go over to the one that's like in the middle, kind of. Over. See that? Like right there? There.
That's one I was talking about, yeah. Peppered moths we're going to be learning about tomorrow in the computer lab. They come in 2 varieties, light and dark. And when trees in England changed because of pollution, one version of this peppered moth started becoming more common than the other. And we'll learn about that tomorrow. This is a katydid. Its body is shaped exactly like a leaf. Even like a cat. Yeah, where is it?
Right there in the corner.
Where is that?
Right there.
Up a little bit.
It is right. Like right here somewhere.
It's somewhere right there. So easy to find, but it's right here somewhere on this side.
It's on the rocks.
I see it.
There it is.
There's see it.
Oh.
One.
Oh, I see it with the line there.
Again, here's the peppered moths. Here is the dark colored one. Here you have the lighter colored one. And again, when the trees changed, one version of moth became better suited to that ecosystem than the other. Mimicry is another interesting one. So mimicry is when one species evolves to look similar to another species. Okay? This, for example, is a deadly coral snake. It's poisonous. It would kill you if it bit you. But it has bright coloration to ward off predators so that they know not to eat it. This one, all right guys, listen. This one is not deadly at all. This is the scarlet king snake. It's not at all poisonous. But it has evolved a pattern of colors that look similar to the coral snake. How is that helpful to it? Kayla?
Because then like other animals will think that it's poisonous when they won't go.
Exactly. It's evolved to mimic this species.
So you're saying I could pick that up
Yeah.
and go like this?
This is a monarch butterfly. They are poisonous because they eat milkweed and incorporate that poison into their bodies. So most birds won't eat monarch butterflies. This is a viceroy. It's not at all poisonous, but it has evolved to look like the monarch to trick predators into not eating it. This is a bee orchid. It has evolved, the petals of the flower are fuzzy and they're colored like a bee. And actually what happens is bees think it's another bee and they try to mate with it. And in the process spread pollen of one flower to another flower. So it's another example of mimicry. Here's some more insects that look like leaves. Here's a one that looks like a willow leaf.
I see it.
Oh, that's like a.
I see it.
Oh, we were not looking at the way they look, the way they walk.
Even a toad mimics a leaf. Yes.
Mr. Dino.
Michael?